If you say, but doesn't that contradict our belief in the unity of God? He replies, God is an organic whole, but with different manifestations of power. Again, these are basically verbatim quotes from various Hasidic writings. God is an organic whole, but with different manifestations of power. Just as the life of the soul is one, though manifested variously in the eyes, hands, and other limbs, God and his sephirot are just like a man and his body. His limbs are many, but he is one. Or to put it another way, think of a tree which has a central trunk and yet many branches. There is unity and there is multiplicity in the tree, in the human body, and in God too. So now, what if the same rabbi, these are entirely my words now, says, do you consider that in our scriptures, God was pictured as enthroned in heaven, yet at the same time he manifested himself in the cloud and the fire over the tabernacle, while also putting his spirit on his prophets. And all the while the Bible tells us that his glory was filling the universe. You see that God's unity is complex. In fact, what I'm saying, based on the witness of scripture, is much more simple than what a mystical Jew would say based on the teaching of the 10 Sfirot. It's quite fascinating that there are religious Jews who to this day, when they pray and when they speak of God being echad, being one, they pray for the reunification of God, meaning the reunification of the Sfirot and the divine essence. Quote, these religious Jews, Hasidic Jews who pray this way, they believe that, quote, the purpose of the performance of the mitzvot, the commandments, is to help the Shekhinah to unite with Tiferet, which is the Sephirah of glory or beauty, the male principle. The sins of Israel hinder this union and prevent the reunification of worlds, which is a necessary prerequisite for the coming of God's kingdom. The Hasidim, in accordance with this belief, adopted the formula much deplored by their opponents for the sake of the unification of the Holy One, blessed be He, and His Shekhinah, which they recited before the performance of mitzvot. Isn't this interesting? That in mystical Judaism there could be prayer for the reunification of aspects of the divine nature, which is somehow in disjuncture. We know some folks who are ultra-Orthodox Jews who are committed believers in Yeshua. It's interesting, we're often challenged, well, produce these people. Let's meet with them. Well, if you knew what some of them went through, if you knew the opposition that some of them have faced, and if you know how some of them realize if I come out with my faith, I lose everything. My family turns against me, everything. My whole community turns against me, and my life will be threatened. You can understand why they're not exactly ready to appear on national television and give their testimony on some Jewish outreach show. But I tell you before God, I know some of these people. I have friends that work with some of these people. And it's interesting that for some of the Hasidic Jews who have come to the Lord, that they don't have a problem with some of these issues of God's complex unity. Some of them are quite quick to embrace the concept of Yeshua's deity. This woman I mentioned yesterday who had been with Lubavitch for 17 years, a certain light went on when she came to the Lord. Then she began devouring these books, and she emailed me one day, just having read through my discussion of the divine nature in Volume 2. She emailed me, "You're a genius, this is amazing." Well, it wasn't particularly genius to me. This is just prayerfully studying and looking and drawing certain conclusions and dialoguing to make sure I had my understanding right. But for her, from her background, these things had much more meaning. It was much more powerful, especially the aspect of Yeshua's divine nature and his relationship to the Father. From her background, it was an easy jump for her. What I'm saying is this: I believe in certain ways, the way that the church has explained things through the years has been so systematized, has been so packaged, that it no longer uses biblical language and biblical concepts, but rather theological terms which would be very foreign to a Jew devoted to the Scriptures. Now, Jewish tradition develops in certain ways that is constantly pointing away from Yeshua. I understand that. But I believe if we use more biblical language and biblical concepts, we don't sacrifice an ounce of what we believe to be true, but we communicate in a way that A, is more scriptural, and B, will ultimately be more intelligible to a Jewish person, perhaps even be less of a stumbling block to a Muslim if we seek to communicate in a more biblical manner. So, for example, I have no question that the overall witness of the Scriptures brings us to the conclusion that God's unity is triune. I have no question that the clear witness of the Scriptures points to both Yeshua's full humanity as well as full deity. But I believe it would be far better in our presentation and speech and more biblical through the whole Bible to emphasize his unity and to describe his complex unity. We do not have the New Testament, for example, saying God who is three in one. I don't argue with the concept. I don't argue with our songs of worship that sing in adoration of our one God in those terms. However, if we are seeking to communicate these truths to someone that may not have that revelation, that insight, I'm not talking about being deceptive. I'm not talking about coding something over, and then when people get initiated, you tell them the whole story. You give them this nice sales pitch, and then when you win them over, and you say, oh, by the way, this is what we really believe. God forbid. God forbid we should state anything that is not fully true about God. I'm simply saying that rather than use the language that has been passed on through theological reflection in church circles, primarily Gentile church circles, where the issue was not the same issue as we're dealing with in Jewish circles, let's go back to a more biblical and Jewish method of presentation and speak instead of the one God who is complex in his unity. Now, those words, complex in his unity, are my words as well, except the thing that is in harmony with the scriptural emphasis is the emphasis on his oneness. The emphasis on his oneness. Now, when we come to the question of the divine nature of the Son and why we hold to those truths, once again, we are in the habit of not stating things biblically. We are in the habit of stating things based on later theological reflection that also was the product of theological debate. Look, if you have someone that is constantly knocking on your door, trying to convince you of their particular view of a subject, and bothering you with this and harassing you with it and challenging you with it, you're going to come down even more strongly on the opposite side of that view. In other words, your emphasis is going to become exaggerated. When I was in college, I had this speech class, and we had to engage in different exercises. Everyone in the class had to give a persuasive speech on a subject and then be graded for it, and then everyone had to participate in a debate on a given subject. And so for the